but that does. Venezuela has been in the news for quite some time now. It's been challenged by U.S. sanctions, declining global crude demand, declining prices, and many other factors. For the next hour, we have with us Risa Grais-Targow, Director of Eurasia Group, and this webinar will be moderated by Lisa Viscidi, Director of the Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries Program of the Inter-American Dialogue. Risa has a lot of new information to bring us that you're going to find really useful. She's responsible for Eurasia Group's coverage of Venezuela and several other countries. She's also worked for the U.S. Department of the Treasury, Alcoa, the Albright Stonebridge Group, the Institute of International Finance, and Dow Jones Newswires. Risa holds a master's degree in international economics and Latin American studies from Johns Hopkins. Okay, before I phase out and leave it to our moderator and speaker, I want to briefly tell you about some upcoming webinars. This one you can register for on the NCAC site now. July 14th, Colorado State Senator Chris Hansen is going to discuss the many things that are happening on the power grid in that state, the securitization of ratepayer-backed bonds for the retirement of coal plants, the transition to other forms of generation, the Western power grid, moving to an integrated Western grid. And he is just not a politician doing this on the side. Chris Hansen is co-founder and director of programming at the Colorado Energy and Water Institute. He is a real energy expert that is in the Colorado legislature, and you do not want to miss this. Again, this is free for NCAC members on July 14th, and non-members can join as well. And I'm really pleased to announce a webinar on July 24th by the U.S. Association for Energy Economics. You all should have gotten an email about this already, where TJ Conway, head of research at the Energy Intelligence Group, is going to be speaking on the energy transition. What is that? Well, TJ is going to tell us how some of our large, highly capitalized, biggest energy companies in the world are making commitments to low carbon solutions and transforming their business models. This is going to be great. He's been putting a lot of original work into this, and this is a first of its kind thing. So you want to be on the leading edge of this, and I'm going to be placing this on a more prominent place on our website very soon. So block out July 24th as well. Now I'm just going to hand it over to Lisa Viscidi to begin the webinar with Risa Grais-Targow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here and participate in this webinar. And as a member of the Leadership Council of the NCAC, I was really glad to see that a lot of new members signed up as a result of this event, and also that we had a lot of our regular members joining. So I will jump right into the questions for Risa. I just wanted to mention first that after we have a dialogue with me asking Risa some questions, then we're going to take some questions from the audience through the chat function. So please feel free to start typing in your questions at any time, and I'll manage those when we wrap up with my questions. So Risa, my first question, let's start with talking about basically the state of play in the oil sector. So Venezuelan oil production declined from over 1 million barrels a day before Juan Guaido assumed the interim presidency in January 2019 to about 600,000 barrels a day in the months after. The US sanctions shrunk Venezuela's export market, restricted cash flow for the sector. So what is the current status of the oil sector? Where does production stand? What's been the latest impact of US sanctions? And how is PDVSA getting by in terms of cash flow and export markets? If you could bring us all up to speed on the latest, that would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, and hi to everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I've shared my screen just to show a couple graphics while we kind of set the scene here. But I mean, the short answer to your question is that the situation is pretty dire. You know, on the production front, the data that we're getting for June suggests that production is actually down to around 400,000 barrels per day. And this is really a product of several factors. I mean, the US sanctions initially imposed last year obviously were a complicating factor, but as you can see from this chart, I mean, production had been declining very steadily and even aggressively over the past couple of years due to cash flow constraints and really horrible management of the sector. Now, the US sanctions obviously kind of complicated the picture further. First, because PDVSA couldn't export to the US, which was its kind of largest cash generating export market, and had to find new markets to export to. And then, you know, since those initial sanctions, we've also seen the US kind of building on those by targeting shipping companies and trading companies that had been working with PDVSA to try to help them find workarounds to that kind of first round of sanctions. So the sanctions are one factor, and it's just become even more complicated since Rosneft, which was playing a really key role in helping to commercialize PDVSA's crude, they announced in February that they were actually leaving the country. They sold their upstream assets there and announced that they were departing. And that was after the US had sanctioned two of their subsidiaries that had been involved in the trading of Venezuelan crude. So they kind of stepped out of the equation, at least for now. We can come back to that later. And that's been a further challenge for PDVSA in terms of finding other intermediaries and partners to help them export their crude. You know, obviously an additional challenge is just the current oil price environment, which has kind of compounded all of these problems because I think before the collapse in oil prices earlier this year, you know, Venezuela was already selling its oil at a discount. There was kind of an economic argument or an economic appeal for their barrels, which they were selling very cheaply. But in the current oil price environment, you know, a lot of the economic incentives for companies to kind of take that risk, especially on the sanctions side, to do business with PDVSA, those kind of calculations have really started to change. And so I think that's been another challenge. So just looking here in terms of who's buying Venezuela's crude now, as I mentioned, you know, for many years, the US was the biggest importer. It used to import around 800,000 barrels per day just a couple years ago. And now you can see this is the 2019 picture. China was actually the top importer, followed by India. And then Europe and Cuba, you know, closely behind. And then Singapore and Malaysia are on here. These barrels actually they end up going to China. So that's actually part of the China story. And what's been happening is that PDVSA has been using ship-to-ship transfers, basically to mask the fact that the oil is coming from Venezuela. This is a kind of Iranian strategy that they've replicated. And so those kind of other Asian markets that show up as importers are actually transit points that then end up going on to China and India, which are really the two markets that have refining capacity to process Venezuela's particular type of heavy crude. You know, in terms of the cash flow situation, I wanted to share this picture of imports in Venezuela. I mean, I think this tells a broader story about Venezuela's economic situation. You can see that overall imports for the country were 66 billion when the last year that Chavez was in power. Now they've declined to around 6 billion. And you can also see that the share of oil imports as part of total imports has really been growing as Venezuela's production has gotten heavier, and they've needed more inputs. Now, that's really important on the cash flow side because it erodes their kind of oil income. The net oil income ends up being much less, right? Because they're having to pay for imports of lighter diluents to mix with their heavy crude, not to mention gasoline, which is, I think we're going to discuss a little bit later, but which has become a real challenge for them as well. So because of this, the cash flow situation is really dire. I mean, just net oil income last year for the government, so that's oil income minus the imports, was around 19 billion. The figure that we're working with for this year is around 4 billion, according to Eco Analytica, which is a local consulting firm. But it could very well be less than that in terms of the cash flow that the government is actually generating from the oil sector.
That's incredibly low, considering how dependent they are on oil. And well, let's go to the downstream sector. So, you mentioned that there were a lot of imports. There's been massive fuel shortages. Venezuela's refineries are running below 20% utilization. So can you tell us a bit more about how is the country still being able to import gasoline, considering that its refineries aren't working, it's lost a lot of the ability to trade with other countries because of sanctions. And then also, are shortages at the pump, are they going to get worse and worse? Are we kind of in a stable place? What would you say?
Yeah, so the gasoline shortages, they really became the kind of #1 problem for the country, I would say, throughout the spring. And that was even with pretty severe restrictions in place in the midst of the pandemic. So even with, very aggressive mobility restrictions and probably around 25% of normal demand for gasoline, we were seeing day-long lines around the country at gas stations. It was becoming, virtually impossible to even find gasoline on the black market. So it wasn't even a matter of pricing. It was that there really wasn't any in the country. And as you mentioned, I mean, this comes from the fact that the government, they had these swap arrangements in place, and a lot of them were going through Rosneft. And with the collapse in oil prices and then Rosneft kind of backing away, they had this challenge of not really having the means that the swaps didn't make sense anymore, right? So they had this really severe shortage. There's two ways that the government is trying to solve this problem, and actually both involve Iran. There's this kind of much publicized new relationship between the two countries. The first is trying to resuscitate their domestic refining capacity. Their refiners are in really bad shape, and they've been working with the Iranians to try to bring in some inputs to try to fix those refiners, including some technical expertise. And then beyond that, they've started importing gasoline directly from Iran. So we had in May the arrival of Iranian tankers bringing gasoline, and that in the short term has actually really helped to stabilize the gasoline supply in the country. As an additional measure, the government actually liberalized gasoline prices. They're still subsidizing it for some kind of more vulnerable consumers, but they've actually liberalized prices, which is pretty revolutionary for them. So for now, we've kind of seen a stabilization in terms of the supply, although it's now at a much higher cost from the gas stations. But I would say it's still very unclear whether they can put together a kind of a long-term fix. I mean, I'm assuming they're going to end up, importing more gasoline from Iran, but the kind of shipments that came in, those are going to be exhausted at some point in the not too distant future. And then on the refining side, they're clearly working very hard to get those refineries up and running, but that's all going to require resources, technical expertise, maintenance, and I would say those are three things that PDVSA consistently struggles with. So I'm a bit skeptical there.
So you think they'll import some more from Iran, but it's not going to cover all their needs?
The thing is that the imports from Iran cost money. The Iranians have said that they're actually charging the Venezuelans market prices for the gasoline. So this isn't a kind of friendly, swap or kind of generous agreement where they're giving the gasoline away. I mean, Iran really, they need markets for their gasoline. They need money as well. So, going back to that conversation we had about the resources, the government just has very limited cash flow right now. And so the Iranian kind of solution is there. It's just going to require continued cash. And that's, far from a certain thing, right? And just thinking about the economics of it all.
Right. And then going back to their ability to implement some of the plans that you alluded to, So in April, Maduro shook up the leadership in the oil sector. He appointed a new minister, Tarek al-Assami, and a new head of PDVSA, Asdrubal Chavez, and these are now separate positions, which for many years they had been one person with both jobs. So what is the significance of these new appointments? I mean, does this really change anything? And has the new leadership been trying to do to increase both upstream investment and to improve on the refining side? And do you think that any of these measures will make a difference?
Yeah, so the leadership shakeup was important. The two new appointments replaced Miguel Quevedo, who's actually a senior official in the National Guard, and have been holding the dual roles for multiple years. But it also really kind of overseen PDVSA during this collapse of production and kind of mounting challenges with the sanctions. When they first named Tarek as the oil minister, I mean, I think it was a bit shocking, just because he's actually designated as a drug kingpin by the U.S., and so it seemed to be this kind of flagrant disregard for U.S. sanctions. But I also think that within the government, Tarek has this reputation for actually being someone that really gets things done. So when he was the vice minister for economy, over the course of the last year, he was credited for having really stabilized the economy despite U.S. sanctions. And he did that mostly with, I would say, relatively pragmatic policies. He moved to partially liberalize foreign exchange, price controls, kind of the economy transition to basically being dollarized. So he, had this kind of track record of success within the government, and I think the decision to move him there, along with Asdrubal Chavez, who actually has a lot of deep experience in the sector, was a recognition that the problems at PDVSA are really severe and that something needed to change. Now, in terms of what they want to do, the two of them were actually part of a team that put together a restructuring plan for PDVSA, which includes increasing the role and the participation of joint venture partners in the country's joint ventures, and that's something that they're trying to do. And then on the downstream, this price liberalization that I mentioned is definitely, something that Tarek has been pushing for. And then also, they're really focused on getting the refineries up and running. When I think about the upstream plans, I mean, I think that, the plans that they have are I mean, they make a lot of sense, but it's really hard to imagine them being successful in the current price environment and with U.S. sanctions and everything else. So, I think the appointments were definitely they're important, but I guess I don't see them having a lot of impact in terms of the results they can deliver on the production side.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I wanted to ask you more. You mentioned help from Iran and Russia, but let's talk a little bit more about that, because Maduro has been able to stay in power really because, at least partly, of support from allies. So what is currently the key role of China, Cuba, and Iran and Russia, which I think are the four main ones? Are all of them still, which one is most important? Are all of them still really supporting Maduro? Are any of them showing signs of backing away? And in terms of Russia, you mentioned how, the Rosneft trading company was sanctioned, and that made it harder for it to play its role of intermediary, both exporting crude and importing products. What has happened with the Russian involvement? Has it really pulled back as a result, and as well as the other countries?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, I would say in some sense, when we think about the question of Maduro's survival, I think Cuba is by far and away the most important player. The Cubans provide Maduro with military intelligence, and they've really been just a huge help in the government's ability to kind of weed out internal dissent, and make sure that, especially within the security apparatus, that Maduro doesn't face any meaningful challenges. And so, you know, it's not economic support so much as intelligence support, but I think that's been really critical to the regime's survival. And so I think in some sense, the Cubans are the most important of all those allies. Iran has interestingly been the kind of geopolitical ally of Venezuela for years and years. I mean, they signed kind of initial agreements when Chavez was in power, but we haven't really seen that translating into material support until now. I mean, I think this new relationship with the gasoline and support on the refiners is actually the kind of the most material support they've actually provided Venezuela, and it makes a lot of sense for them as well. I mean, both countries are heavily sanctioned. As I mentioned, you know, Iran is needing to sell its gasoline as well. So I think there's kind of economic logic to the relationship. And then I think both countries also really enjoy this kind of geopolitical play of thumbing it to the US. And, you know, it's interesting when the Iranian tankers were arriving in Venezuela in May. I mean, I think those two countries were kind of hyping it up more than anyone, right? Just as a way of saying, look, Iranian tankers are coming into Venezuelan waters and the US isn't going to do anything about it, right? So I think that they also enjoyed that aspect of it. China is an interesting one. You know, China has lent the government of Venezuela, you know, as close to $50 billion mostly in the kind of mid 2000s. They've also, though, really pulled back on their direct support. So most of that lending was done when Chavez was in power. They became much more cautious with Maduro and actually stopped extending new money. Really started relying instead on just giving them some flexibility on the terms of existing loans. So giving them kind of grace periods, some flexibility on interest payments. So they stepped back on the financing side, but as you saw from that graphic, I mean, they're still importing a fair amount of Venezuelan crude. Now, interestingly, I do think that the Chinese are cautious about sanctions. And so, I mean, CNPC hasn't been directly offloading Venezuelan crude. The Chinese have actually been relying on these ship-to-ship transfers. So they're still involved. They're an important importer, but you know, they're not providing kind of direct financial support. And I would say they seem to be kind of treading relatively cautiously around the continued trade with PDVSA, and just in terms of the political relationship in general. I mean, the Chinese will kind of pay lip service to sovereignty and vote with Venezuela in international bodies, but they're not really going out on a limb to defend the Maduro regime. And then on Russia, so Russia kind of originally stepped into China's role and became a really important source of financing for Maduro. And also, you know, they got very involved in the oil sector, both before the sanctions in terms of kind of snatching up some key assets in the upstream. They also have this collateral in Citgo, the US-based refiner that was part of a financial agreement from a few years ago. And so, you know, I think the Russians are very involved, and they're going to be involved for the long term. You know, I read this decision of Rosneft to step away as a reflection of their current economic reality. You know, they were, I think after those sanctions on their subsidiaries, they were concerned, their shareholders were concerned about future US sanctions and about what that could do for their business. But interestingly, I mean, Rosneft sold its assets to another Russian state-owned company. It's basically a shell company. And, you know, my understanding is that a lot of the employees of that new company are former Rosneft employees. So, you know, I think they're going to be opportunistic here. I think they're kind of in a holding pattern, but I think once the economics make more sense in terms of the oil sector, you know, I think they'll be involved again. And then as a final point, you know, I do think that, you know, Putin does really enjoy, I think, like the Iranians, the kind of geopolitical angle here. And so, you know, has been, I think, more proactive in terms of, you know, clearly siding with Maduro. He sent some military to Venezuela last year. So I think is maybe a much more public ally of Maduro than, say, the Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. And turning to the role of the U.S., very important. With elections coming up in November, the Democratic nominee, Joe Biden, is proposing a different approach to Venezuela from President Trump. So how do you think US policy toward Venezuela would change under a Biden administration? And also, if Trump were to win a second term, do you think he would change his strategy toward Venezuela at all?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think Venezuela is just going to be a huge foreign policy conundrum for whoever the U.S. government is in 2020. And that applies to Trump, just because his kind of recognition of Guaido hasn't really worked in terms of bringing out regime change. And maybe even more so for Biden, because, you know, I think that he's going to come in with these kind of heavy sanctions in place. But I think in both cases, you know, the opposition and the U.S. to some extent have really tried everything here in terms of forcing change. I mean, we've had different rounds of negotiation, including with Norwegian mediators, who are kind of the best mediators to international conflict in the world. We've had an attempted coup. You know, we've had protests. I mean, it's really been, and then obviously, you know, very aggressive sanctions. So I think that the challenge for whoever the next administration is going to be figuring out, where do we go from here in terms of trying to force change? You know, I tend to think, I mean, for Biden, you know, I think the focus is going to be, if he does win, it would be on helping. I think we'd see more humanitarian aid to the neighbors. I think, you know, definitely trying to support the region more in terms of how they're grappling with migrant outflows from Venezuela. Biden has also said publicly he's committed to granting Venezuelans in the U.S. temporary protective status. Maybe you would see some more humanitarian carve-outs. So I think there'd be a focus on kind of the humanitarian picture, helping Venezuelans in the region and here in the U.S. But I don't necessarily see him kind of lifting sanctions and kind of abandoning the policies. So I think there'd probably be an inclination towards more engagement, maybe more supportive of a negotiation tactic rather than additional sanctions. But again, I think this is going to be a really tricky one. On Trump, I mean, it's interesting, the Axios interview he gave, I mean, both in terms of what came out of the Bolton book and then this Axios interview that Trump gave, I mean, I think what it revealed very clearly is that he's always been kind of lukewarm on Juan Guaido, the opposition leader, who he recognized that he still is probably lukewarm, or it's less than that on Guaido in terms of continued support. And even that he has this inclination to maybe even sit down and meet with Maduro, right? And so, you know, I think right now, obviously, Trump is constrained by Florida and has electoral considerations there. I definitely don't think he's going to meet with Maduro, precisely because he really needs to get that South Florida vote. But, you know, I think thinking about a second administration, what I took away from that interview was, you know, maybe Maduro and Trump could sit down, right? Maybe Trump's inclination is actually to try to reach some sort of deal where it's a different Chavista in power or some other protections, but allow him to say, look, we won and we got Maduro out. So that seems to me the kind of inclination. We'll see if he actually does anything with it, if he does have a second term.
And would either candidate lift U.S. sanctions unless they saw something from, you know, serious change, or Maduro, without Maduro leaving power, would they lift sanctions?
I think without Maduro leaving power, it's very difficult. I think there is a scenario in which you could have if there's a second Trump administration and you have a kind of Chavista light government coming in, maybe you could see some relaxation of sanctions, you know, something that allows them to say, we won here. But I do think either way that Maduro himself has to be out. And I would think that, I mean, in general, I think the U.S. kind of position and transition framework clearly states that the sanctions are going to remain in place until there are free and fair elections, right? Which otherwise, you know, it's today, those don't look like they're going to happen anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, finally, my last question before taking questions from the chat, from the audience, I think we should talk about domestic politics in Venezuela. So Guaido assumed the interim presidency because Maduro won re-election fraudulently, and the Constitution stipulates that if there's no legitimate president, the head of the National Assembly becomes the interim president. But Venezuela's constitution calls for elections this year that are expected to take place in December. So what do you think will happen with these elections? Do you think Guaido will hold on to the National Assembly and therefore the interim presidency? And if not, what would happen the next day? And will Guaido still be able to maintain the support of the international community?
Yeah, so this is a huge problem for the opposition, and unfortunately, I don't think they really have any good options. So Maduro is moving forward with organizing those elections. Actually, the Electoral Authority is announcing today, I'm hearing they're going to be held on December 13th. And over the past few weeks, Maduro has made it very clear that those elections are going to take place on his terms. So he's been taking over the leadership of some of the opposition parties. He named new electoral authorities that are still, the new electoral body is still, firmly in his control. And these are precisely the types of conditions that make it very hard for the opposition to actually participate in that vote. So right now, there's a very kind of fierce debate within the opposition over whether or not they should participate. As you mentioned, they mostly abstained from the presidential election in 2018, also the local elections in 2018. We had kind of mixed participation in the gubernatorial elections the year prior. But now they're kind of facing this real existential problem in that, the National Assembly is the last institution that they control. And if they don't participate and they lose it, they're essentially just going to become obsolete politically. And so I think this is a real kind of existential challenge for them to decide whether they want to participate on Maduro's terms and still have some quota of representation and power, or whether they want to abstain. I tend to think that they're going to go into that vote divided. So Guaido and his party, Voluntad Popular, I think they're going to abstain. I think they kind of have to, just because of the U.S. transition framework, and they've been very explicit about the conditions under which they participate. It seems like Primero Justicia, which is one of there's four main opposition parties, but it seems like Primero Justicia, which is been more aggressive towards the government as well, is kind of more aligned with Voluntad Popular. I think they're divided internally, but would probably tend towards not participating. And then the two other parties, Un Nuevo Tiempo and Acción Democrática, they seem more inclined to participate, but we'll see. So I think you're going to have them going divided. I think that necessarily means they lose control of the body, and then Guaido is going to lose his claim to the interim presidency. And that's going to be a huge conundrum and challenge for the U.S. going forward. I tend to think that in the kind of short term that the U.S. will reject those results, the regional governments as well, the international community will reject the National Assembly vote, and continue to kind of recognize Guaido or align themselves with him. But I do think that's just going to become more and more awkward over time.
That's tricky, to say the least. Well, we have, I'll take a couple of questions from the audience. So we have one that was sent in earlier by email, so I'm going to ask you that first. I think it's a great question. What is the strategy of Guaido and his government in terms of Citgo and the possibility of losing it? We know that a lot of several different companies are trying to claim Citgo as collateral. There's been court cases in the US. So what is the current strategy, and do you think they're at risk of losing Citgo?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one. So Guaido has really prioritized protecting Citgo from all types of creditors. And so far, the U.S. Treasury has helped him with that. So that includes, essentially so there's a PDVSA bond, the PDVSA 2020 bond that had Citgo as collateral. Treasury has basically blocked the bondholders from collecting on that, even though they, have a legal grounds to. And then you mentioned these other arbitration cases where, these stem from expropriations carried out during Chavez's presidency, but they're coming now to attach Citgo as a way of collecting on their arbitration awards. The most advanced one of those is Crystalex, which is a mining company, and they are, they just keep on getting closer and closer to being able to collect on that. But they actually need a license from Treasury in order to be able to do so. You know, in terms of Treasury's position, I think so far they've just been kind of shielding they've kind of been shielding Citgo from all these creditors. And we'll see if that's the indefinite policy or at some point they change their stance. But I do think if they end up changing that, they're going to have to probably do it for both the bondholders and the arbitration claimants. Otherwise, they're going to be essentially picking creditors or playing favorites, right? And so I think it's either going to be they continue to protect Citgo from everyone, or they decide that, you know, maybe this doesn't, you know, I think there's a tension within Treasury between you know, the people who want to protect Citgo for the opposition and others who say, hey, we have to let the legal system, kind of the US legal system, you know, work the way it's supposed to. So if those voices win, I think we could see a change in US policy such that these different claimants and creditors will be able to go after Citgo, and then we'll see how it gets divvied up.
Interesting. And another question from an audience member, Tom Russo, is Chevron still in Venezuela? So what's the current status there?
Yes, Chevron is still in Venezuela. So Chevron is in a bit of a holding pattern in Venezuela. So with the initial U.S. sanctions last year, you know, they provided a license to Chevron and U.S.-based oil service companies to continue operating in Venezuela. And then they kept on extending them actually for 3 months at a time. They kept on extending them. Then in April or May of this year, they did extend the Chevron license, but they basically said that Chevron couldn't lift any oil. So they're allowed to do basic maintenance. They're allowed to kind of fulfill their contractual obligations in terms of managing the JV, but they can't actively be producing or exporting oil from there. And so I think the kind of shift in U.S. policy was to say, you know, these oil barrels that you're exporting are still kind of benefiting Maduro, and so we're not going to let that happen anymore. But I think, you know, there was a lot of debate within the administration about just revoking the license entirely, and I think at the end of the day they decided they'd rather keep that foothold there and allow Chevron to maintain a presence in the hopes that you know, there's some sort of regime change or they can at least revisit that policy in the future. That license currently expires in December, so actually is kind of also helpful for Chevron because there's kind of reduced risk around the November elections in the US. So their license goes beyond that. So just in case Trump feels like he needs to do something very hawkish on Venezuela, you know, they're not going to be affected. But right now they're in a holding pattern. I mean, we'll see what happens in December, you know, who the next US president is going to be and what the status of the opposition is. But, you know, I imagine that the existing license can be either extended or, you know, revisited if they feel like they want to allow Chevron to do more or less, depending on where we are.
Right. Okay. Great. And another question is, how reliable is any data used to assess the situation in Venezuela? So how do you feel about, you know, production estimates, export estimates, who's importing how much? Do you think those are very precise? And how do you get data when the government doesn't provide it?
Yeah, so the government's data is pretty bad. I mean, we rely on sources that use tanker tracking data. I think that's the best that anyone has. And so that includes, you know, some of the kind of international organizations like the IEA and OPEC, although they also get direct reporting from the government. Reuters with Refinitiv, they actually have very good data. They also use tanker tracking. So I think that's the, you know, how we piece together the picture. And I tend to think those are pretty reliable sources. But certainly, you know, anything that comes from the government directly, I take with a huge grain of salt.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
According to the government, they have the best COVID-19 testing in the world, so, or at least in the region. So we have to take their official data always with a grain of salt.
Right, right. And what are your thoughts about the president of Mexico trying to broker a U.S.-Venezuela resolution?
I mean, I think that that's going to be tricky. You know, there's been different efforts over the years to have Mexico involved in some sort of brokered solution. Actually, at some point, you know, there was a conversation about essentially replacing the barrels that Venezuela is sending to Cuba and other allies, having Mexico and other oil producers in the region actually replace those so that those countries had kind of less allegiance to Venezuela and maybe would support a deal. I mean, I think that there's I mean, I think AMLO, you know, I think he's obviously kind of friendlier to Maduro and maybe wants to do something, but I think there's a lot of other kind of international players, both within the region and outside, that are going to be resistant. And I mean, if he can get Maduro out of office, then I think anyone would be supportive. But I think absent that, it's really hard to see the U.S. getting on board.
Mm-hmm. And if the opposition extends the interim presidency of Juan Guaido next year, if he's able to hold on to that position, what do you think the U.S. policy would be toward the control of overseas assets like Citgo? Do you think that that will affect the calculation that you were talking about in terms of whether to keep protecting Citgo or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that those types of actions are just, if Guaido is no longer the president of the National Assembly, I just think it's going to become, again, I go back to I think the word awkward, the term awkward is the best way to describe it. I mean, that's not to say that the U.S. won't do it. And maybe it's something that, you know, you can definitely do for a year or two. But it's unclear to me whether that can just be the indefinite policy, especially because the kind of original intent of protecting those assets was to preserve them for an opposition government at a time when it felt like there was a legitimate opposition government and one that was close to being in power. And so, you know, the more doubts there are about the legitimacy of Guaido's leadership claim, and the farther they seem from actually obtaining power, I think it just becomes more and more challenging to protect those assets. And I would say, you know, as an aside here, you know, it's interesting when Guaido came in, he appointed this whole, you know, parallel government, essentially. You know, he has ambassadors, he has, there's an ad hoc board of PDVSA that essentially has, you know, he has a head of Citgo, and there's PDVSA, he has an attorney general, he has all of these different appointments. And, you know, initially he had a lot of kind of high profile people taking those positions and being really excited about working with his government, I think precisely because it felt like they were very close to actually being in power. But, you know, here we are now, 18 months later, and a lot of those people have already left or are leaving because I think it's become clear that they're not that close to power, right? And so I think the dynamic within the opposition is also this, I think this sense that Guaido is really losing momentum. His approval ratings are now at 25%. You know, they were at 60%, they're at 25. Maduro's are at 13, but it's not that much better, right? So I think in general, you know, Guaido just is facing a lot of challenges, losing momentum. And I think, you know, to the extent that that continues into next year, I just think it becomes harder for the U.S. to maintain its current policy.
That's right. Yeah, I just read, I think yesterday, that some members of the PDVSA board, the Guaido PDVSA board, one member resigned because he said it was an unpaid position and he couldn't go on like that. It had already been a year and a half. And then also, I think, I mean, it becomes harder and harder for the U.S. government to maintain its position supporting Guaido when he seems less legitimate. And it also, I think they're starting to sort of lose interest. You know, there's not as much momentum in all the members of, for example, the Trump administration to continue supporting them. Seems Trump himself is losing interest. Although, as you said, it's a political issue, so that's probably what makes it still important for him. And another question: if Guaido loses his position and the U.S. continues to recognize him, what about the rest of the roughly 60 countries who do still recognize him? So, you know, we talked about what the U.S. would do. Would the other countries, you know, are they likely to drop off earlier because there's less at stake for other countries besides the U.S.?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess it just feels to me like the recognition of Guaido from other countries, it maybe matters a bit less. Certainly in terms of
less
this,
of a cost to it.
yeah, and certainly in terms of this kind of asset protection issue and some of the kind of direct implications for the oil sector and the Venezuelan economy. I mean, I tend to think that I think that what's going to happen for the U.S. is that they're going to reject they'll reject the National Assembly elections. Then they'll have to decide if they continue to recognize Guaido. But I imagine they'll find a way to keep kind of supporting or recognizing the Venezuelan opposition. So I don't think that so much that there's going to come a day where they're going to say Maduro's the legitimate president. I mean, I think they're going to continue essentially rejecting Maduro and his government. And so maybe that means that, you know, for governments around the world, they do something similar, right? Where they just kind of shift to maybe not necessarily saying Guaido is our president, you know, he can have his emissary in the embassy, whatever it is. But they just kind of continue to isolate Maduro, but maybe walk back a bit their explicit recognition of Guaido. But look, you know, when the U.S. moved last February February to recognize Guaido, you know, I think it felt like this very exciting kind of crazy momentum and just this like really radical foreign policy idea. But there were, I think, a lot of kind of critics who said, what if this doesn't work? Like, what are you going to do? This is, you know, like it always felt like something that was supposed to be short term, right? I think that, you know, Bolton kind of convinced Trump to do that with the selling point that, you know, Guaido, this was going to force Maduro out. Guaido was going to be the president, and the U.S. was going to have, you know, it would be this just kind of phenomenal win for the Trump administration. But that policy only made sense in some, you know, as a short-term, I think, policy tool. And so I think now we're seeing the downside of doing something like that, because, you know, when he doesn't actually, when we don't actually get to regime change, then you just have this extremely kind of challenging and awkward diplomatic situation for not only the U.S. but, you know, governments throughout the region and Europe and elsewhere.
Yeah, there were clearly some risks to that strategy. And another question that was asked is, does OPEC have a position on Venezuela? Do they support Venezuela? You know, have they weighed in on what's going on with the oil sector or any of the other issues?
I mean, Venezuela is a member country, and so I mean, they recognize Maduro. I mean, you know, I don't know that they're explicitly supportive, but they kind of recognize him and work with the government. So I don't think they necessarily tend to take political positions, but in terms of the organization, they have the continued relationship with Maduro, and it's the opposition's kind of quota in the oil sector is really is Citgo, just because it's the one U.S. based asset, and so therefore has these special protections.
Okay. Another question is, are China and Iran providing expertise to PDVSA in the upstream sector or in refineries? I think you mentioned that Iran was trying to help with refineries, but is there any other sort of technical support or expertise in upstream or downstream from any of these countries? So I'm not sure about the Iranians are definitely supporting or trying to support in the downstream. It's less clear to me if the Chinese are doing anything in the upstream. I think in general they've been kind of pretty hands-off, but I honestly don't know. I think the only one that I'm really sure about is Iran. Mm-hmm. And I mean, do you have there's a question, I think you addressed this sort of, but about Russia's long-term game in Venezuela. Do you think that they're just betting on Maduro? What would happen if there was a change in government? Are they, because I think China is in it for the long haul, regardless of who's in power, whether it's a dictator or a democratically elected leader, you know, whether it's so-called socialist or not. but what do you think about Russia? And if you disagree with what I just said also.
Well, so China's in it for one because the government still owes them close to $20 billion. So I think in China's case, they just want to make sure that they're repaid. And so they need to ensure that they have this continued relationship in order to get repaid. And I think that's their overarching goal, is just to make sure that whoever's there is going to honor their obligations. I think in the case of Russia, it's more kind of opportunistic. I mean, Rosneft was, I think was kind of getting some great deals. PDVSA has basically at this point offered them every single asset in the sector, some of which have worked out and some of which haven't. But I think Rosneft's kind of play, or Russia's play, has been let's capitalize on the fact that this is an oil sector that's a government that's desperate for cash, and an oil sector that's where they're willing to give us really generous terms on these various assets. And so I think in that sense it was more kind of opportunistic from an economic perspective. I think so. In that sense, I think that they are in it for the long haul. And once, assuming that the economic kind of incentives shift in terms of the price environment and maybe sanctions at some point, I do think that Russia is going to stick around the oil sector. And as I said, I think the fact that Rosneft sold their shares to the Shell company it's kind of like a game of musical chairs, but they're still there, right? Despite the very publicized Rosneft departure. I do think on the political front, I think Putin's support of Maduro it's a little bit shallow. I mean, I think that it's more about him wanting to be seen as an international power broker than the fact that he is personally really invested in Maduro himself. And so I think Putin relishes the fact that he's viewed as a critical player in forcing regime change in Venezuela, and that that Pompeo seeks out the Russian foreign minister to talk about Venezuela, and that he's kind of viewed as being someone who has influence in the US's backyard, as it were. So I think that matters to him more than Maduro himself. And so I think in terms of the kind of political commitment to Venezuela, I could also see them, working with a different government or supporting some kind of change, as long as Putin gets to be seen as being a broker and having a seat at the table.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have one final question. So it's a little bit complicated. What are your top 3 actions that you think should be taken by either candidate, I guess in the US, in 2021, either a presidential candidate from the US, if the goal of the US is long-term US energy interests, maximizing US energy sector interests, and ensuring stability and preventing a complete collapse of Venezuela's oil sector? So I guess sort of assuming that the US goal is our own energy interests and ensuring stability in the region, what do you think should be the main actions? That's a very hard question. I don't know if you want to try to answer it. If we knew the answer.
I guess, I think taking into account the existing sanctions and kind of resource constraints that I think are going to just continue to hang over the oil sector, I do think you need some sort of political breakthrough in Venezuela in order for the sector to recover, obviously in order for sanctions policy to change materially in such a way that the US could begin importing Venezuelan crude again. And I think the barriers to a political agreement in Venezuela are really significant. I mean, I think that the reason that Maduro has been able to stay in power for so long is that the kind of circle around him, I mean, at this point, the exit costs for them on a personal level are just so incredibly high. So you know, if maybe you've lost all this money and legitimacy, and I think we all assumed that, you know, once the oil sector revenues collapse, that Maduro would go as well. But I think the kind of ruling clique here just has too much to lose. I mean, there's cases at the International Criminal Court. There's, you know, several of them, you know, face, you know, extradition charges or extradition efforts from the U.S. You know, whatever it is, I think that the personal costs for them are very high. So I tend to think that the solution here is you need some sort of agreement that really provides them with guarantees about their future outside of government. And that's really challenging. I mean, I think there's a lot of mistrust between the opposition and the government. There's also plenty of other cases around the world where, you know, there's some sort of power sharing agreement or transition. And then, you know, whatever the agreement is, that some government in the future reneges on it. And so I think that just adds a lot of uncertainty. But to me, I still think the only path forward for a solution to Venezuela's crisis is some sort of agreement. And I tend to think that the opposition and the U.S. and opposition's other international supporters, they're going to have to put a lot on the table, I think, and really compromise in order to get the type of kind of political compromise that they're looking for.
Very interesting. Well, I think, yeah, that's going to be difficult, but it seems like that's the next step that the U.S. has to take and keep trying with negotiation. So, well, we're out of time, and I think I pretty much got through all the questions. We had tons of questions from the audience. So I really want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. This was extremely informative, and it was great to have you on this webinar. So thank you so much. And I will turn it over to David. Thanks. David, you're on mute. Yeah, there you go.
Risa Grais-Targow, thank you so much. This has been tremendous, and we should have had you in front of NCAC members long ago. We appreciate taking an hour out of your schedule, and thank you, of course, also Lisa Viscidi of the dialogue. And I want to go back into one more time a few details. I will put a link to this recording on the website in a matter of days. So when you come back from the holiday, it'll be up there. And now that you're all members, you have access to it. And a brief plug for our last couple of webinars coming up. July 14th, Colorado State Senator Chris Hansen talking about the power grid in his state. And on July 24th, TJ Conway of the Energy Intelligence Group talking about the big energy transition that major international companies have to make as they pursue their lines of business and adopt low carbon solutions at the same time. That's a USAEE webinar. I'm going to be driving you to the USAEE website for that on July 24th. If you have any further questions for Risa or Lisa, I'm sure if you get them to me at admin@ncac-usaee.org, we can somehow get it to them. But thank you for tuning in. I want to thank our panelists one more time, and everyone have a great afternoon and a safe holiday weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.